Welcome back to another clay video. Today we are going to create this huge display of every world from New Super Mario Bros. Wii. Special thanks to Minty Fries for designing this display stand. Make sure you check out his channel where he creates some awesome 3D printed objects, some of my favorites being these 3D printed Pokemon cards. I was recently gifted this box of Polymer clay from Hippie Crafter. I feel like in the last video where I did a review, I barely scratched the surface of what you can really do with clay, so today I'm going to make something a little bit more complicated. Starting out with the base, we need to make all of these dents and alternate between different shades of tan and brown, and this will give us the super iconic ground look of grassy areas in Mario games. I can't say this is in every Mario game, but it's common enough that you've probably seen it before. This might sound kinda weird, but when I was making this, it actually made me feel hungry because it reminded me of some type of pudding dessert. Something I've never done before but I've seen in other videos is using scissors to cut polymer clay. And let me tell you, this is a really satisfying feeling. It leaves behind these little marks though, so I had to smooth them all out using the dentist pick. After getting the grass onto the base, I lifted up some random tufts of grass, and I think this makes it look a lot less boring. Using some brown clay, we have these two little rocks we need to create. And the second one is more of a slope going up to the top. We need to take some green grass to cover the tops of these. I tried using out one of these new scooper tools that they sent me, but it didn't really work out for this so well, so maybe there's another usage for that. Again, another super iconic thing in Mario games is these little hills. They don't always have dots, usually they have eyes on them, but I have seen these dotted ones before. We have a couple different varieties. We have blue raspberry, green apple, and lemon. Let's get those onto the base. Now the next thing we'll create is this little mushroom that's just kind of sitting there on the base. This will be the stem, but we will have to attach this after baking using some super glue because it just wasn't strong enough. This is the method I always use for making bushes or treetops. Just roll a bunch of little balls of clay together and it gives a pretty nice looking bush. I've added in some little red dots on the bush for either berries or flowers, and I think this really helps add some brightness and color into the map. I know everything's already some pretty bright colors, but there's not much red, so it gives a nice contrast between all of the green stuff. I just set up all of the flower stems and leaves, so now let's create the flowers. This is the same way that I always make flowers, but honestly, it works out really great and it's pretty easy to do. This time I decided to expand on this method a little bit and make these little dents, and I'm surprised at how much detail it really adds to it with the little bit of effort it takes. Now that we have a nice little variety of flowers, we need to make a small hole in the base where we can put our signpost. After baking, we can use our trusty super glue to assemble all of the scenery. I don't know if you consider super glue to be a tool, but for me, super glue is one of the most handy tools you can have with polymer clay. I've probably gone through near 20 bottles of super glue in these last few years of making things with clay. Up until this point, nothing was really all that difficult to create, but this sign gave me so much trouble. First, I thought I would make it with some popsicle sticks, and after assembling the sign, it looked pretty good, so I decided to paint it with some brown. This brown was a little bit darker. I ended up using a lighter shade later on, but for now we're just going to use this very dark brown. I tried using a paint marker at first, but it was just a little bit too big of a tip, and yeah, this doesn't really look like a W. So I thought I would try out this new needle tool that they gave me. This one started out pretty good, and I thought it was going to work out, but somehow I just couldn't seem to fit it all in there. There just wasn't enough room, and it kind of just looked like garbage. So, away with you, sign. Let's move on to making one with clay, which I guess I should have just done from the beginning. But I wanted to try something new and use the popsicle stick for the sign, but for future reference, I know that that's just a bad idea. My idea for this was to just carve out the spot where the W1 is going to be, and then I could just fill it in with some green clay. Just like the painting methods, this did not work out on my first try. You're probably seeing the 4th or 5th try with the clay, but finally, we have a nice little sign. After gluing it together, we can put it into the base. And that is our final detail, so here it is, World 1 from New Super Mario Bros. World 2 starts out pretty much the same as World 1. We have this swirly ground pattern, except this time I'm going to use some shades that are more closely colored to each other, so the transition between them isn't really too visible. I think this will help it give a more natural sand look. I just kept layering up these different shades until we got a nice looking pudding dessert. Using a knife, we can trim off the excess around it. And now we have a really nice smooth transition, but the edges are a little bit jagged, so I want to smooth those out a little bit. Taking the top sand color and mixing it with some brown, we can get the color for the pyramid. The desert world is one of the more lightly decorated worlds, but I think this looks pretty good for a desert since deserts are usually pretty empty. I'm using the dentist pick to make all of these different lines into the pyramid for the different bricks. We also have some vertical lines to separate the different pieces. And our pyramid is complete, and I'm really happy with how this turned out. Let's get this onto the base, and we can move on to our next step, which is creating these little platforms in the background. These platforms are mostly oval or circle, but I think that adding these jagged edges around the side really adds some extra detail to it, especially in a map that isn't all that detailed on its own. We have a very light tan for the top covering. And let's get those onto the base. I'm sure there's a lot of different methods to creating a cactus, but I thought of this idea and it actually worked out really well, so if I need to make more cactuses in the future, I think this is how I'll do it. We have the basic shape of them, but cactuses are known for their spikes, so let's add some nice little spikes onto them. They're more like dots, but I wasn't going to try to make spikes this tiny, they would probably just all break off. Here is our nice little green cactus. So let's get both of these onto the first platform, and the second platform, for whatever strange reason, has a barrel. It kind of isn't really fitting for a desert theme, but somehow looks pretty decent. I'm creating these little planks into the barrel and adding some wood grain detail. I would say in Mario games, the desert and underwater are always my least favorite worlds. They're just a lot harder to navigate and definitely harder to find secret stuff. And I feel like the enemies are just generally more annoying in the desert. With the barrel in place, we can start creating the sign, and I learned my lesson to not use a popsicle stick this time and just go straight for the clay. I made this sign much bigger than World 1, and I think that really helps with creating the letters and numbers into it. It really gives you a lot of extra space. It only took one try to create the sign this time, and I'm really surprised at how smooth I was able to get the lettering. I guess the bigger sign really made a difference. After getting our sign in shape, we need to create the sign post. I've added a little wooden texture into it. And let's just make a hole in the base for where that's going to be. And we are ready to get baked. After baking, you know what time it is. Let's attach the back of the sign to the post and add the sign into the base. And that is our final detail. So, here it is, the Desert World, World 2, from Super Mario Bros. Wii. Just like the last two worlds, we need to create this pattern of layers. And also like the other two worlds, I can't think of it as anything else besides a dessert. To get these nice little wavy stripes, I dent in the clay on the edges, and I do it in the same place on every single layer. After cutting away the excess on the outside, we're left with a really nice wavy pattern on the inside. This world also has a tiny little platform on top, so I did the same thing in a much smaller scale. Since this is a winter-themed world, we need to add snow on top of pretty much everything on the map, starting with the platforms. I made the snow nice and wavy so it overhangs the edges, and I think it looks really nice like this. Now let's create one of the most common objects in every Mario map, these little bumpy hills. Some of the games have eyes on the hills, and some of them don't. I'm not sure if this is completely random or there's actually a reason. I feel like I might have made these just a little bit too big, but I should still have some room to fit in some trees. I had to think for a while of how to create some tiny little pine trees. I came up with a few different ideas, but this one seemed the most likely to work. These trees have snow in between each layer, so just like the base, we can just start layering them up until the top of the tree. And once we get there, we have a nice little cone. I like that they used a different variety of colors with the trees. Most games just use green for trees, but it's nice to see some purple and blue. We can put the trees onto the map. And we can move on to creating the World 3 sign. So far, this has been the trickiest part on any of the worlds I've made. It's just so tiny and hard to get these little green worms in the right place. It helps a lot to first map out where they're going to be, and the clay sort of just kind of follows that pattern. We need to create a post for the sign. And we can't forget a hole for the sign to go into. Now, we are ready to get baked. After baking, we can use some super glue to attach the sign together and onto the base. And that is our final details, so here it is, World 3 from New Super Mario Bros. Wii. The first 3 worlds I created had this wavy layered pattern. We don't have to create this pattern anymore for the rest of the worlds. Now that we have our sandy layer, let's start working on the main platform. We need a piece that's sort of in the shape of a peanut. I don't want it to sit kind of awkwardly on top of it. I want it to blend in nice and smooth with the sand, so we need to clear out a big place for it to go. Let's blend these two pieces together. And we can start out with some stars. When I saw this map had some stars, I was not looking forward to it. I only had 3 or 4 stars this time that didn't turn out, so it worked out pretty good. Using some green clay, I created this nice grassy pattern for the top. On the last world, we had the snow sort of overhanging it in different sections, and I wanted to do this again with the grass. I've darkened up the grass color with a little bit of black, and we'll use this to create the bushes. These are some really highly detailed things for being as tiny as they are. After we have these 3 layers, we can use some red clay to create the tiniest flowers I have ever made. In the center we have a little bit of yellow, and I created 4 of these to go on top of the map. Let's get those into place and we can move on to creating the trees. This was something that took a lot of thinking to figure out how I was going to create these trees. They have this striped pattern, and it's something that I've never created before. And that wasn't even the hardest part. I think the hardest part to figure out was the top of the tree. I had to figure out some way to create some treetops without building them on top of the tree. Being unbaked, these trees are just a little bit too weak to hold up the leaves. So I started by taking some different colors of green and blending them together to get a nice little swirl pattern. I flattened it all down and started cutting out some leaves. I tried to go a little bit random with the shapes of them so they weren't all exactly the same. I also need some small and some big because there's 2 different sizes of trees. This is the idea I came up with. Using some waste clay will create a little bit of a stand, and we'll build it on top of that. This will act as basically the top of the tree, and after baking we can remove this support. And hopefully we'll have a nice little treetop we can glue on top of our trees. Now let's make some bigger flowers, which are much easier to assemble than the ones on the bushes. The final clay detail before baking is creating the sign. You're probably very used to seeing the process of this by now. It's exactly the same on every world, just a different number. I would say this turned out to be my favorite world so far, and by that I mean the design of it. Water worlds are the worst in any game I've played. They're either really hard or really terrifying, because underwater is just home to too many creepy things. Like that giant eel in Mario 64, that thing terrified me as a kid. After making the hole for the sign, we are ready to get baked. After baking, I was pleasantly surprised that this actually worked out. Most times when I try something new, it doesn't work the first try. The support removed really nicely and left us with a perfect treetop. Let's take some super glue and attach those onto the trees. And I think these ended up being the coolest trees I have ever created. Let's assemble the sign and get that into place. And that is our final detail. So here it is, World 4 from New Super Mario Bros. Wii. I'm trying to create all of these worlds to be the same size, but I feel like I'm slowly getting bigger and bigger with each one. Maybe by the time we hit World 9, it will be the size of my table. The thing is, the first couple worlds were just a circle. Now we're getting into different shapes, and I think the ovals just kind of make the world bigger in general. Now that we're done with our main land piece, let's start working on the grass. This one is a little bit different than the other ones. We have 2 layers of grass, which I didn't even notice until I started creating it. The first layer is a very dark green, and we don't really need to cover the entire thing, so I just made a little strip to wrap around it. For the top layer, we can take some brighter green and shape it into what looks like a piece of lettuce. I really like how the bumps on these two pieces sort of overlap each other in different places. I think it looks really cool. We have some random rocks stuffed into the side of the map. And now we can repeat the same process again at a much smaller scale. I was very surprised to see that this miniature version of the world doesn't have any purple poison. That's such a common thing in these worlds in every Mario game. It's almost like a lava world not having lava. I've cut out some little green chunks and we can curve them into some macaroni. Taking a thin layer of some yellow clay, we can start creating the spikes. This is my favorite detail on this world and probably my favorite detail out of all the worlds I've created so far. These little spiky vines just look so nice. And once we get these onto the world, it starts to really make it come to life. Next up is a tiny little green solo mushroom. And we can place this right in front of that first platform. It seems to be a common theme with these worlds to have flowers, and I'm not really a fan of making them. So luckily, this map only has 2 flowers. Over the years, I've developed a few different ways of creating treetops, depending on the type of tree you make. But this type of tree, whatever you call it, I've never created before. So I had to come up with a new idea of creating trees at a very tiny scale. These little branches are a part of the trees on the map, so I had to create them. But it's very debatable if that was a good or bad idea. When you create branches this small, they become very fragile. And a few of them broke off while I was trying to attach the treetops, and I had to remake and rebake them. It became quite a problem, but once I've realized that I pretty much have a failure on every single clay creation, you start to get less upset about it each time. So these are the treetops I created. They're pretty basic, but they look pretty nice. They're not going to be able to stay right now how they are, so we'll attach those after baking. We don't get our purple poison, but we do get some purple succulents. This is our final piece of plant life on this world. I've just sort of randomly placed these together into little patches. And the most repetitive step of all is creating the sign. There's 9 worlds and there's 9 signs, and they are exactly the same except a different number. Since it's so repetitive, I'll start to show less and less with each video. We need some texture on the signpost, and we can't forget a hole to place the sign into. And now we are ready to get baked. After baking came the disaster of these tree branches breaking, being rebuilt, and breaking some more. I'll save you guys the misery of watching that, and I'll just skip to the good parts. Let's put the sign together and into the hole. And that is our final details, so here it is, World 5 from New Super Mario Bros. Wii. Let's start out by mixing the color that we'll be using for pretty much everything. I always have a hard time figuring out how to mix these sort of grayish brown rocky colors. This ended up being way too light, so I added in some black. Looks much better now and a lot closer to the color of the actual map. This is going to be the base, although you're not really going to see it, it's more so just a way to hold everything together. One of the main features on this map is these tall rocky mountains, and these are in a couple different sections. I basically just kept going around it in circles with the blade so we get a lot of nice jagged edges. And as we get higher up, the sections just get smaller and smaller. We can start stacking up these pillars. We have 3 pillars in total. This one is the biggest one, we have a slightly skinnier one, and then a very small one on this side. Now to add in some nice rocky texture, I'm going to be using the toothbrush. Seems like a really weird clay tool, but I've been using it for years and it works perfectly every time for rock texture. Just make sure this isn't the same one you're using for your teeth. Let's get those into place, and we can start working on the main platform. There's nothing special about it, it's basically just a square. But we have to cut out this little section on the side. Because this platform is a double platform, we have two different sections to it. I'll hit it again with the toothbrush, and then we can place it onto the base. A very common enemy in the Mario games is Monty Mole, and you usually see this enemy come flying out of a hole in the wall. These holes are roughly shaped like their body, but this is so tiny I'm just going to be doing some circles. Around it we have some jagged rock pieces. Since the bottom section of this big platform actually doesn't have anything else on it, I decided to damage it a little bit with my knife, and I think it looks a little bit less empty this way. We need to create a hole for the signpost, and we can start working on the warp pipes. I think this is a pretty cool detail they added into this world, and it gives it a little bit more color instead of just the whole world being brown. We have this little box that's kind of in the middle of where the pipes intersect, so it must be some type of connector piece. We're going to create 4 different warp pipes, although only 2 of them look like the traditional warp pipe with the top section. The rest of them are going into things, so you can't actually see this part of it. Let's start building up the pipe system. And we have 1 taller pipe right in the back here. And our final detail before baking is the sign. I mentioned this, I think in World 5, that it's very repetitive, so I'm just going to show less and less with each video. And if you really want to see how they're made in more detail, you can go back to one of the first worlds. Now, we are ready to get baked. After baking, let's assemble the sign using some super glue. And we can get that into place. And now the one thing we're missing is some clouds. This map has a very high elevation, so it gets really foggy way up there. Using some super glue to hold everything in place, we can start coating the entire outside in a very thin, wispy layer of wool. The one thing I've noticed with wool is it gets very frayed and hairs stick up all over the place, but luckily we have a scissors to give it a nice haircut. So I just spent some time trimming off every tiny little hair that was out of place, and we're left with this. So here it is, World 6 from New Super Mario Bros. Wii. I still have some of this hippie crafter clay left over from that review video I did a while back. So I've been kind of picking and choosing the more undesirable colors, the ones I'm not really going to use for anything, and I've been using these for filling on my bigger creations where I don't really want to use as much of the good colored clay. Foil is a nice alternative as well, but foil can get pretty lumpy, so having some waste clay to do this with is very nice. Now you might be asking, what is he creating right now? I am creating the clouds for the base. Although these clouds are not white, I will soon transform them into some nice fluffy white clouds. In order to get this cloud to be nice and seamless, I came up with this idea of baking a cloud first and coating it with a sheet of white clay, and it worked out amazingly. This is by far the nicest and most fluffy cloud I have ever created. Now we need to make some crates to go on top of this cloud. It takes a little bit of time, but you can form a really nice cube using only your fingers. Just one of the many examples that you don't need to go overboard buying tools. We have a nice wrapping going around all of the edges, and now the corners. We have these screws on the corners, which I think are a very nice touch, and it reminds me a lot of Mario Sunshine. I did the same as well for a bigger purple box. And now we can destroy half of our hard work by cutting them in half. I didn't really think this through, but I guess I didn't have to make the details on the bottom half. Let's create some different colored warp pipes. And somehow, I guess I didn't record or lost the recording of me putting the crates onto the cloud, so we'll just have to skip over that part. Let's add in these warp pipes. Now we can start working on the vine. If this has a name, I can honestly say I've probably never seen it. When you find this vine, it usually takes you to secret areas up in the clouds, but since this world is already in the clouds, I guess it just takes you to some higher up clouds? Let's get that into the base, and we can start working on the head, which is very simple. It has the same lips that a piranha plant does, so I've cut these at a slant, and this will make them much easier to attach into each other. After a couple minutes of battling to get this to stand up, I think it's pretty obvious it's not going to stay by itself. So let's remove the head and we can just attach that after baking. Our vine is not complete unless we have some leaves, and in the spirit of trying to keep things nice and cartoony, I'm only going to create just a dash in the middle. I think if I added any more, it would start to look too realistic and wouldn't really fit in with the rest of the world. The final detail before baking is creating the sign. We can sketch out our number and letter, and then we can fill that in with some bright green clay. Finally, we need some texture on the signpost, and we are ready to get baked. After baking, we can break out the super glue and start putting everything together, starting with our vine. I have carefully attached all of these leaves, and they seem to be pretty sturdy. To avoid any ugly wires, I decided to glue these onto the boxes, and it actually looks like they're floating. Let's put the sign together and get that into place. Except we have an issue. I forgot to make a hole for the sign. So I used the dentist pick to hack a hole into it, and we can place the sign into the hole. And that is our final detail. So here it is, World 7 from New Super Mario Bros. Wii. The base for this one is very simple. We just need to mix together some orange and yellow, and we'll get this nice swirly pattern for the lava. Although the map just shows up as solid orange, I thought I would add a little bit to it and make this lava pattern. This is going to be the main platform, and around it we have a strip of slightly darker rocks. The funny thing about this map is it's completely stuffed. You could barely fit anything else on it, but it's all just gray. Everything on this map is rocks, which I guess makes it pretty easy to create. Out of all the worlds I've created so far, this one was definitely created in the least amount of time. After using the toothbrush to get some nice texturing, I've added in a few extra little rocks, and we can round off the top edges. Now we can wrap this around our main platform, and we have a very simple, easy solution to creating a whole bunch of random flat rocks. I'm going to cover up this hole with some rocks, and this is where we'll be adding in the sign. Moving on to the volcano, we have another shade of gray. This time I added a bit of brown to it so it really stands out from the rest of them. I probably went a little bit overkill on the rocks, but it's better to have them and not need them than have to go back and make some more. Basically, I'm just coating the outside of this with some random rock shapes, building up to smaller rocks at the very top. And now we can take some more of the main lava color, and we'll create a nice little fountain coming out of the top. When I said this map is simple, I meant it. We are just about done. We just need some extra rocks to fill the empty void where there's nothing but lava. Although I do like the look of this map, I feel like they could have added more to it. Like an enemy or literally anything would have made it look a bit more interesting. Anyway, let's move on to the sign, our final detail before baking. Don't mind this sloppy 8, I had a hard time carving that out. We can cover it up with some clay and try to forget that ever happened. And now, we are ready to get baked. After baking, let's take some super glue and put the sign together. We also need to trim it down a bit. And let's put this into the rocks, and that is our final detail. So here it is, World 8 from New Super Mario Bros. Wii. We're gonna start out with a Skinner blend, something I've seen many times before but never really had a reason to make. I'm not really going to explain this method, but if you want a detailed breakdown of how it works, you can find a link in the description of this video. Now this may be the 9th and final world, but it's not the final video. I'm gonna have one more video in the series where I combine all of the videos together and also create a huge display to show off all of these worlds together. And since the series is coming to an end, I want you guys to vote in a poll to help me decide which series I will be creating next. I'm also going to be creating some bigger projects in the background, but it's nice to have a fun little series to fall back on if those videos end up taking too long. And if you're watching this in the grand finale video, you can still find a link in the description to the poll, and it will still be valid for a couple weeks. Now it's time for the star. I know it's become kind of a joke on the channel that I can't create stars, or at least not very easily, but can anybody really create a star on their first try every single time? I've made so many of them and it doesn't seem to get any easier. After baking, we can remove the paper. You might be asking why I'm not just taking the star off the table to get the paper out, but I need to keep the seal between the clay and the pan for when we get to the point of pouring in the liquid clay. If I don't do this, the liquid clay is going to run all over the pan and I'm gonna have to do all of this over again. Liquid clay is always so much fun and I have no idea how it works. But after baking, it gives the most amazing results. I baked this little piece so I could test it out with a marker just to make sure everything works. And it turns out, it doesn't. This is about 2 hours later, and I went back to one of my clay figures I used these markers on. It was maybe 2 or 3 months ago, it still smears. Which is very disappointing considering it's the same brand that makes my clay. You think they would have kind of the same quality. I've never had a problem with markers not drying on clay, so it's kind of disappointing. I want you to take a note of the color of this resin. It's supposed to look like the color on the front. We add a couple drops into the liquid clay, and we get this sort of weird orange color, which is nothing like the picture. But lucky for us, it's the perfect color for the center of the star. So we can pour that in and start pushing it to the edges until we have a nice flat surface. And now we are ready to get baked. It can be a little bit tough removing this clay from the pan, but with a little bit of work, it usually always comes off clean. And you can see after dyeing it, it's still pretty translucent. Now we can take the marker again and start working on the checkered pattern across the entire back of the star. But don't worry, I have a solution to this marker problem. The solution is some gloss varnish. Again, another product by the same company, just like the liquid clay, that works perfect, so I don't understand why these markers are so terrible. Now we have a glossy finish on the back, which I personally don't like on clay figures, but the top side still looks like it did before we put the glaze on. Now let's create the final sign of the series. We need a little bit of texturing on the post. we can throw that into the oven, take some super glue, and put this onto the world. That is our final details, so here it is, World 9 from New Super Mario Bros. Wii. I recently got a 3D printer, and I think this is going to make an awesome addition to some of my clay videos. These are the pipes that the worlds are going to sit on, and it looks like they're going to take about 8 hours to print. I've never done a time-lapse before, but this seemed like a good place to try it out. I think it's a pretty cool effect that you can see it turn from day to night in the time of this 8 hours of printing. You can see the sun go all the way across the sky, and although it kind of ruins the lighting, I think it looks really cool. Now we have our 3D printed parts, and as you can see, they are a little bit messy. So I'm going to take some sandpaper and file that down. 2 hours of sanding later, we have some pretty smooth parts, so let's start painting. Everything I had to paint for this took about 4 to 5 coats, which was to be expected, especially if you want a nice smooth paint job. I know you like to see failures as well as success, so this is my first failure. This base, I tried to do hollow so it would save on printing time, but it just didn't work out once it got to the bottom. This one, however, I didn't print hollow, and it worked out great. It took about 14 hours to print. And another failure was the logo for the top. I made this way too big. So I stopped it kind of halfway through the print and sized it down to get this one, which is the perfect size. This took about 5 hours to print. Another thing that happened was one of these bricks is overhanging where the logo is supposed to snap into. But that was pretty easy to remove, and now it fits in perfectly. With the printing complete, I gave these 2 blue pieces a nice black coat. On top of that, I tried to get the perfect Mario brick color, this sort of reddish brown color, and I think I matched it pretty well. After that, I painted inside all of the letters on this logo, and we can get it snapped together.
Inside this magical basket, we have my old Mario magnets. Mario has definitely seen some better days.
Don't worry, I'm not going to be getting rid of the figures themselves, I just didn't have any other magnets to work with. I'll make sure to get some more magnets and place them back onto these figures. Now my idea to keep the worlds in place is to use some magnets. The magnets inside of the pipes are a lot stronger than this strip. I bought this strip because I thought it would be nice to be able to get it to be any size, but they're really not that strong. They're strong enough that they slightly hold it together, which is enough for what I need. But I really wouldn't trust these for, say, a fridge magnet. Now it's time to superglue the pipes into place and start adding the worlds into the pipes. At first I had them all facing straight, but then I realized it didn't look very good, so I turned them all so no matter what angle you're looking at it, they'll be facing you. After all of this work, I didn't want to settle for something to look kind of alright, I wanted it to look amazing. So this world should be floating in the air. I went and looked around my house for anything clear I could find to hold this up, and what I came up with was a plastic fork. It might sound weird, but it actually worked out really good. And that extra level of creativity kind of just adds to the whole display. With World 9 in place, that is our final detail. So here it is, Worlds 1 through 9 from New Super Mario Bros. Wii. Again, I couldn't have made this video without Minty Fry's help, so make sure you check out his channel. There's a lot of videos I think you might like. This has been an amazing journey creating all of these worlds, and I can't wait to see what the next series will bring. Make sure to join in the poll to help decide which series I'll be creating next. You can find a link to that in the description of this video, and also I'll pin the first comment. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you all in the next one.